clearly stated the porch is Victorian, built against the late 15th century wall. Note the doorway lintel, which has grotesque corbels in the form of mythical beasts, one apparently upside down. These are at each end of the door lintel. These are quite rare in Sussex, but fairly common in the West Country. They were probably intended to frighten off evil spirits from entering the church. To the right, notice the holy water stoop, not currently in use. And above the door, you will see a panel indicating the seating capacity of the church in Victorian times. Now, as you go in, look across the church to the Saxon north door that we saw outside from the other side. Notice its full height, its narrowness. High because the Saxons were wont to use banners in procession carried through doorways. Narrow, it is said, to make it more difficult for the devil to enter. Our parish church has evolved as the result of building and rebuilding over the centuries. There may even have been earlier non-Christian settlers on the site, because the ancient yew tree, well over 1,000 years old, grows on the north side of the church, and this is believed by some to indicate the position of Neolithic graveyards. Certainly, early Christian churches were frequently built on pagan sacred ground. Moreover, if the Celts before the Saxons settled on the long ridge as they had done on the downs near Plumpton, it seems likely that they may have gathered here to worship. The dedication of this church to St. John the Baptist may also indicate an early Christian association with this spot, for major Celtic festivals were held at midsummer and midwinter, and Midsummer's Day is also the feast day of St. John the Baptist, just as Midwinter's Day is Christmas Day. The earliest church would have been built of wood, possibly by Wivell or one of his successors as Lord of Lances. The name Wivelsfield is contained in an 8th century Anglo-Saxon charter as Wivelsfield, indicating that Wivell had given his name to this open area of possibly arable land, and thus inferring the existence of a farming community. It is known that local lords built 95% of early churches, often as status symbols and usually on their own land near their homes. The first stone church was probably built just before the Norman conquest. Then, when William the Conqueror arrived, he parcelled out all the land to his own men, and our part of Sussex was given to William de Warenne. He therefore owned the church, and this he gave to the great Cluniac Priory in Lewes, which he had founded in 1077. The reason for this gift being that the tithes, that is 10% of all the produce of the land in the parish, would be received by the priory, thus contributing to its upkeep. By studying the architecture that remains today, it is evident that this early Saxon church had only a chancel and a little 27-foot nave. This would have been without seating, but possibly with wall paintings. Then in the 13th century, extensions were made to the church due to the growing population and growing wealth. The tiny chancel was extended and the arched recess in the north side built. You can see that here. Was this for the placement of a memorial or an effigy? Was the little window above it a squint for lepers? Or was the recess an Easter sepulchre? These were always situated on the north side of the chancel, usually in the sanctuary. The Blessed Sacrament was placed in an aperture of this structure on Good Friday and remained there until early on Easter Day. Whatever, we can't now be sure. Also in the 13th century, the chantry chapel to my left was added. Not a lady chapel, note, but a chantry chapel. This was built by a local landowner so that masses could be said for the repose of his soul and those of his family. Later, another landowner, John Moore, the wealthiest local man at the time, and we're talking Tudor times, wrote in his will, dated 1542, that he wanted 20 priests to sing dirges and masses for my sons and all Christian souls, and each priest to receive 6pence. In addition, at his year's mind, that is the anniversary of his death, 30 masses, and for the next 5 years a trentle of masses, and to pay for every trentle 10 shillings. A trentle being 30 masses celebrated daily for 30 days. That was the 13th century. During the 14th century, the nave, central part here, the nave was extended westward by 14 feet, that way. The south aisle and the tower were then added. They were built towards the end of the 15th century. When the nave was re-roofed, then with trussed rafters and crown posts, as you can see today. To take the weight of the new tower, a massive strengthening block was added because it was needed to reinforce the southwest pillar. A porch, now gone, would also have been built at the same time as the south aisle. Porches were important for both religious and secular reasons. The services of marriage, baptism, and the churching of women all began in the porch. Business was also transacted there. In 1626, a document regarding the sale of land contained a condition that the sum of £7 was to be paid at Wivelsfield Church, South Porch, at Michaelmas. Poor relief money was also paid in the porch. In 1766 and 1767, several references were made to Widow Holcombe receiving poor relief at vestry meetings or at the church porch. By the end of the 15th century then, we have our church with a small chancel, that's this part, compared with a long nave, a chantry chapel, a south aisle, a porch and a tower. Where did the money come from for all this building? Firstly, the church was the focal point for the whole parish. Church seasons, festivals, the colours, the music, worship and teaching all brightened up a hard and drab existence. It was a meeting place for friends and neighbours. The people needed their church. By common law, the repair and upkeep of the chancel, this part behind me, was the responsibility of the tithe holder, the nave, that of the parishioners. In 1587, Dennis Bartlett, the tithe holder, was summoned before the Archdeaconry Court in Lewes. The charge that the roof of the chancel is not sufficiently repaired. Endowments, bequests in wills, and pew rents all provided money, but a major source of income was the church ales, a sort of medieval coffee morning organised by the church wardens. They begged or bought the mast and brewed the liquor in the church house or parish room. Now, what of the tithe system? This was originally for the upkeep of the church and clergy. Tithes might be paid in crops, livestock, or in labour. These would have gone to Lewes Priory. But at the dissolution of the monasteries, tithes passed to the crown. Henry VIII then sold them to laymen who bought them, so they then received the tithes, and not the church. So to gain income, he sold off these rights to aspiring wealthy locals. In 1593, there was a lengthy dispute between our clergyman, Richard Shoswell, who lived in a cottage at Lockstrude, that's down by Jacob's Post, and the vicar of Ditchling, as to who should receive the tithes for Lockswood. Old men remembered beating the bounds as boys, and they were brought in to say whether Lockstrude on the edge of Ditchling Common was in our parish or not. It was decided it was. And what of the priests who served here? What of the men who served this parish? We know that in 1267 our priest's name was William. He was a monk from Lewes Priory, and we can imagine him coming dressed in his monk's habit, possibly on horseback or on a donkey, but possibly also on foot, to minister to his flock here. At the dissolution of the monasteries, King Henry took with the tithes the advowson, that is the right to appoint the clergyman to a parish. In our case, he granted this to Thomas Cromwell, and when he fell from grace, it went to Anne of Cleves. When she died, it reverted to the crown. In 1558, Queen Mary granted it to the Bishop of Chichester, and this living became a perpetual curacy in the Archdeaconry of Lewes. A perpetual curate was one who did not have housing provided with his living, but one had to find his own accommodation. He nevertheless had the status of a vicar. Our priests in Wivelsfield remained perpetual curates and not becoming vicars until the Victorians built the old vicarage which is behind the church here in the 1860s. Until Henry VIII's time, all churches, of course, were Roman Catholic with celibate clergy, and Mass was said or sung in Latin. In 1538, however, with the Reformation, came the order to destroy all relics and shrines, rood screens and crucifixes. Chantry chapels were dissolved because masses for the dead were deemed superstitious. That's our chantry chapel loses its function. Then in 1553, Mary Tudor comes to the throne and everything had to return to Roman Catholicism. Her reign lasted just 5 years, and then came Elizabeth I, and England was now Protestant again. First the clergy was celibate, then they were allowed to marry, but for the 5 years of Mary's reign, priests were expected to be celibate again, and then they could marry again. So what happened to the wives? People generally took the faith of the monarch. If they did not, they would be labelled as heretics. And we must remember that in Lewes, only half a day's walk away, Protestants were burnt at the stake in Mary's reign. Stability returned with the Elizabethan settlement, from which the Church of England takes its origins, and a compromise, as it was, between Catholicism and full-blown Protestantism. Although people were required to go to the established church periodically by law for form's sake, the authorities did not, as the phrase went, seek a window into men's souls. In Jacobean times followed Elizabeth, and it was then that was installed a splendid three-decker pulpit that was here until the Victorian renovations. In the 1630s, the Archdeaconry Court still flourished, and two incidents from our parish come to mind. In 1636, Thomas More, another Thomas More of More House, one of the gentry, attended a meeting in the chancel to examine the accounts of the church wardens and overseers. He was subsequently summoned to attend the Archdeaconry Court. As the court record reads, after some debating of the said business, he, sitting in the window of the chancel aforesaid, did rashly and unadvisedly take tobacco there. He was caught smoking. In fact, his punishment was to confess formally to the priest in the same chancel after evening prayer the following Sunday. He was then duly pardoned. And in 1638, Bridget Barrett was accused of thrusting pins into the wife of John Dumbrell in the church at the time of divine service, and for other irreverent behaviour. She admitted that she did thrust a pin into the wife of John Dumbrell by reason she sat down in her lap. Knowing that church attendance was a duty at the time and seating probably limited, was this a case of musical chairs with Bridget the winner? And what better weapon than a hatpin? This little church has been associated with a number of important figures and important men. Why? We're not sure. Many learned clergymen with MAs and BA degrees from Oxbridge colleges were here, served here, a kinsman of the Bishop of Oxford, and one who was commanded by the Sergeant of the House of Commons. These were all incumbents here. Why did such men come to this little church in a rural parish? With the advent of the Civil War in 1642 and then the triumph of the Puritan cause, the occupancy of our pulpit caused controversy. From correspondence dated 1660 and 1661, that is immediately after the restoration of Charles II, so once the Puritans had been swept away, it is apparent that the parishioners had delivered a petition to the king against Thomas More of More House, who held the tithes and advowson, for not supplying a minister to this church for 3 full years, although he had still been collecting the tithes. To the bishop, Thomas More defended his Church of England loyalties, writing that he would not maintain the unlearned and unordained maltman in the living, when the predominantly nonconformist parishioners tried to introduce him as their minister. On the 30th of March 1661, there had been a violent breaking open of the church door to gain entry, and here are Thomas More's own words, for an unordained, illiterate, schismatical fellow to preach. There followed an argument between Thomas More's son and Thomas Godman, of Great Oak Hall, of course, who was in favour of the fellow. the bishop kept Thomas More's letter to show to the king. It is odd to think that the choice of our clergyman here in Wivelsfield had involved not only the parishioners and the patron of the living, but also the bishop and the king himself. So we come to the 1700s. Some 50 years after that incident, in 1716, a west gallery was installed. Across the front of it was inscribed, "The bounty of Mrs. Frances Moore of this parish, another Moore." It was common at this time to erect galleries for musicians, where before organs came in. So they had musicians, fiddlers and others, and they built these galleries for them. About the same time, a dormer window was inserted in the roof of the nave above the north door, not where the north door now stands, of course, but roughly where that central arch is. And that was to give light for the musicians, we think. How the church looked prior to the Victorian renovations can be seen in a painting of approximately 1830, which shows the original Saxon north wall, but with square house-like windows and a dormer window in the roof above that door, the north door. It also shows the east end of the chancel before the extension, showing it to be exactly level with the east end of the chantry chapel. An early photograph of the interior, taken about 1849, also shows high box pews, the three-decker pulpit, the choir stalls in here in the chancel, and a wooden reredos behind the altar. These were usually inscribed, that is the reredos, with the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and sometimes the Creed. On either side of the chancel east window, we see large figures, one of Moses and one of Aaron. Now we come to the Victorians. They moved in, and in 1868, and did a thorough job because they felt the church was old, inadequate, and in need of general repair. When the West Gallery was then removed. When it was removed, Hebrew texts in the distemper were discovered on the south and west walls of the nave. Unfortunately, the plasterer followed his instructions exactly, and everything was hacked off. The carpenter/joiner was allowed £5 to dismantle the Jacobean three-decker pulpit and construct the present one using the carved sounding board at the top upside down for the base. Weeds were removed from the tower walls. The old outside steps that served the gallery from outside that went up into the tower were removed, and the exterior door in the west wall of the tower was blocked up. The Saxon doorway, meanwhile, was carefully dismantled and moved and repositioned in the new outer wall as the Victorians added their north aisle. But they, in this case, were wise enough to save the Saxon door, reassembling in their new Victorian wall. The chancel was extended to the east, and the east window, the original east window in the old chancel, was taken out and moved and put in the east end of the north aisle, the new north aisle. The total cost of the works was £1,225, much of it generously given by the Tanner family. All the stained glass dates from the 19th century or later. The church warden's accounts show that in the late 19th century, heating was by a solid fuel stove, coal and coke being ordered for it and blacklead to clean it. Lighting was by oil lamps. If you look up towards the roof, the lights make it difficult. You can still see the pulley wheels on which the bracket that held the oil lamps for lighting were hung and could be lowered to be lit and then raised again. A harmonium in those days provided the music, and that went on until 1877, when an organ was installed in the chantry chapel. The chantry chapel, therefore, went out of use as for a religious purpose, but simply became the container of the organ. The choir was seated here in the chancel with pews each side, high pews, and there were two each side, and there were two stalls, one such as this, but another matching one on that side, in the traditional fashion. A carved reredos was placed behind the altar in 1902, it's Edwardian, but fashions changed and it was moved into the chancel in 1937. Now, as we come to the 20th century, the nave was, as they say, reseated. In other words, all the seating was changed in 1925, and the present pews, oak with fine linen fold bench ends, was installed as a memorial. They were installed as a memorial to Walter Renshaw and his wife and their sons. Now, the Renshaw family were great benefactors of this parish, as you will know if you've heard of the Renshaw room in the New Village Hall, and also what used to be the Renshaw reading room on Green Road. In 1936, further works were needed, and the wording of the faculty application for permission to carry out the works reads, in consequence of there being no vestry, the subsidence of the chancel floor and the imminent collapse of the organ. They must have bought a rather dumb organ. I think it didn't last very long. So the chancel was remodelled. In 1937, the vestry, a flat-roofed extension, was added behind this little window, and the organ was rebuilt. In fact, I'm not sure that it was rebuilt to any great extent, because a new organ was sought and was moved into the current position where you see the organ now. Really rather an important organ in its way. It was built for a grand Scottish baronial house near Glasgow, and a very famous, well-known, celebrated that is, organ builder and pioneer, Noel Mander. I've got a quote from him here. He was trying this new idea of a tracker action, which he thought would be preferable to what was customary at the time. That's part of the mechanism in the organ. And he was a pioneer in this. And he writes, it slowly took off. I got the idea early on. I went up and bought a lovely house organ built by Watt of Glasgow with pneumatic action. It was quite a sizable job, but the action was foul, so we took it out and put in the new tracker action. That was in about 1949. I think it might have been 48. And it is in Wivelsfield Parish Church in Sussex. So we are very blessed to have this quite important organ in the history of organ building. In 1956, because of an advanced dry rot, the whole floor of the nave and the aisles was dug out and relaid and faced with oak blocks. This allowed the nave floor to be lowered level with that of the aisles. Previously, it had been 3 or 4 inches higher. So this central block of floor was higher than the aisles. And that was indicative, so they say, of a church dedicated to St. John the Baptist, the symbolism being rising from baptism into the body of the church. The movable communion table is used as a nave altar here for our main services now. We have a splendid set of bells. They're the second lightest in Sussex. And the oldest of these bells dates from around 1450. Very old indeed. That one is called Florence. We have one from 1766 who's called Agnes. We have one from 1714 which is called Blossom. We have one from 1944 called Edna, and one from 1906 called Phoebe, and finally Ethel, 1954. They're not in date order, I'm sorry, but there they are. Edna, Agnes, Phoebe, Ethel, Florence and Blossom. Bells are always named for ladies. Above the font at the back hangs the roll of clergy of incumbents of this parish dating from 1419. This was a gift from Sir Errington Kevill of Lunce's Hall. The memorials within the church, the ancient memorials, were all removed from their original setting in the body of the church by the Victorians in 1869 to allow for their extensions and their building works. They are now all bedded in the floor and the walls of the tower. There are memorials there to the Moore family, of which we've heard so much, dating from 1664. Also tablets and a large ornate monument to the Richbell family. These last were originally in the Chantry Chapel. Note the memorial in the tower where the wording is both the right way up and upside down. Did the carver make a mistake and start again? We don't know. In the north aisle, 3 memorials record victims of the First World War. The tablet with the 21 names of those lost from the village, the wooden cross which marked the grave in Flanders of 2nd Lieutenant Alan Rees-Griffiths, RFA, killed in action 1915, and a tablet to Lieutenant Commander Douglas Saxby Thomas, RN, who went down with his ship in 1917. Also in the north aisle is the memorial to Henry Thomas, vicar here between 1884 and 1914, that is 30 years. And near the vestry door, a floor slab dedicated to the wife of the Reverend Henniker Gottlieb, vicar between 1925 and 1946 through the Second World War, 21 years. It was he who placed the small Crusader cross in the pillar above the pulpit to record his pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 1930. 2 former vicars are remembered in tablets in the Chantry Chapel. A tablet to 2 sisters, members of this parish for 46 years, is in the south aisle, and another in memory of Theophilus and Dorothy Maxwell Davis, benefactors of the church, on the west wall. Now we come to the windows. As said before, there is no early glass in the church, all being either Victorian or more recent. The east window glass is Victorian, dedicated to George Dixon, perpetual curate of this parish from 1829 to 1863, 34 years. The chancel's north windows are in memory of Jane Tanner, who died in 1881, aged 90. The Tanner family held the Advowson for years, and Jane herself had been very generous to this church. The small window in the chancel, above in the recess, is of uncertain origin, but it depicts St. John the Baptist with the words Ecce Agnus Dei, behold the Lamb of God, scratched above the figure. For centuries, this church was dedicated only to St. John the Baptist. It was not until 1925, under the influence of the Reverend Henniker Gottlieb, then vicar, with his cross there later on, that the dedication was altered to include also St. Peter. The north aisle's east window, the stonework for that, formed the original east window here in the chancel before the Victorian extension. It's 13th century in origin, but placed in its present position in 1868. The glass is Victorian, and it's dedicated to Elizabeth and Thomas Renshaw, the Renshaw family again. The lovely modern window of St. Francis, surrounded by birds and flowers, in the wall of the north aisle, is a memorial to Montague Allwood, 1880 to 1958. It was he who made Wivelsfield internationally famous in the world of horticulture, perfecting Allwood's dianthus, one strain of which he named Sweet Wivelsfield. Two other modern windows are also in the north aisle, one in memory of Bertha Jackson, towards the west end. For many years she was the Sunday school superintendent, and the other near the war memorial to the fallen in the north aisle is to Sir Bryant and Lady Valborg Godman Irving of Great Oat Hall. The last is a striking modern window depicting the church's oldest chalice surrounded by the beloved elements of the family home farm, red Sussex cattle, and all the wild flowers that grow on their land. There is still a thriving church family here. Every Sunday, week by week, there are either 3 or 4 services, and the registers show that an average Sunday, approximately 100 people worship here. Although for a very long time the style of worship here was simple, Protestant fare, with the offices of Matins and Evensong being the mainstay, and said communion at 8 a.m, probably once a month for most. In the 1970s, the churchmanship changed, and now much of what we do would be recognised by our medieval forebears. The chantry chapel is once more in use for communion services, and its medieval aumbrey once more contains the reserved sacrament, which is used to take communion to the sick. Vestments are worn by the priests, in particular Gothic chasubles. The liturgical seasons are observed, and the colours of altar frontals and vestments are changed according to season. Purple for Advent and Lent, white for Christmas and Easter, red for the Holy Spirit and or blood for martyrs, and green for the generality, the long season of Trinity. The principal service is now the sung Eucharist, in which the Eucharistic prayer is intoned and the responses are sung. We do not, however, have incense or altar bells. Many of our vestments and other artifacts are displayed in the church.